Hi guys, Brian Latimer here. As promised, I'm going to do a video series this year called The Basics. This is just basic knowledge for you guys that are out there just getting into fishing. We're going to go with the simplest of concepts and baits so you can get the basics and be a better fisherman. First segment of this particular initiative in this particular series, and the first segment is going to be on one of probably the most simple and most versatile baits that you'll ever come across. It's really old, but it's one of the techniques and one of the baits that catch your fish from ponds, rivers, all the way to lake, kayak fishing, no matter where you're doing. It's called a spinnerbait. I'm sure you guys have seen it, been familiar with it, maybe even fished it a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the specifics and some of the things that'll make you a better spinnerbait fisherman. You know, looking at spinnerbaits, there's a couple different elements that make up the whole spinnerbait category. There's a jig head. It's basically a jig head. You've got an arm that comes out here, and you've got a couple blades attached. That makes your spinnerbait, and that's very simple, and that's the very basic concept of what this bait is. But again, there's a lot of different components with this bait that makes it a lot different and determines where and how you'll fish the bait, and we'll talk about that. This particular bait, looking at the blades, as I mentioned, you've got a skirt, a jig head, you've got an arm here where your blades are attached. You can see you tie it up here in the corner right here where the little R is. It's where you're going to tie your knot at. I'll use a Palomar knot to attach it to my line. And you'll notice there's a bunch of different blade sizes. When you're talking about spinnerbaits, what makes one spinnerbait different from the next, for the most part, is going to be the types of blades. And there's basically two types of blades that you need to be familiar with. There's a couple there, of course, there's a whole gamut of blades out there. In general, there's going to be two style blades that you're going to use. One's going to be a willow leaf. This is a double willow leaf spinnerbait right here. Double willow leaf comes from the concept that there's two willow leaf blades. This is going to be more of a narrow style blade here, and the other is called a Colorado blade. This is a Colorado bladed spinnerbait right here. You can see the blades on a Colorado blade, on a Colorado spinnerbait, are a lot more blunt, a lot more round, and they throw off a lot more vibration. So basically, you've got a Colorado bladed spinnerbait, and you've got a willow leaf spinnerbait, and it can be a combination of those two blades as well. You can have, a lot of times you'll have a Colorado up here on the front with the willow leaf on the back. Typically, if it's going to be a double Colorado, it's just going to be a smaller Colorado up front, number 3 or 4 Colorado on the back. And the difference in between these two spinnerbaits, this with the Colorado blade, that's going to have a lot more vibration, a lot more resistance in the water, so the bait doesn't sink quite as fast. This is going to be a great bait if you got really stained water, really dirty water. You want to go with the Colorado blade spinnerbait. If you're fishing a little clear water and you want to work the bait a little faster, go with the willow leaf spinnerbait. Also, there's going to be a lot of difference in the type of forage and shad they're feeding on. If they're feeding on really small shad, a lot of times you're going to want to go with the willow leaf spinnerbait. Willow leaf spinnerbait has a little bit more finesse presentation, a little bit more streamlined. You'll definitely be able to tell the difference. When you go out there and make a cast with a willow leaf spinnerbait, you don't really feel much vibration in the rod tip. When you go out there to throw your Colorado bladed spinnerbait, you're going to feel a lot of thump, a lot of vibration, a lot of action. And what that is displacing a lot of water, and it's going to let that bass hone in on your bait a lot quicker. So muddy water situations, dark water situations, go with your Colorado bladed spinnerbait. You're going to be throwing in a lot clearer water, a lot smaller shad, smaller fish, want a little bit more finesse style presentation, go with your willow leaf spinnerbait. Now, as for colors with spinnerbaits, you can get all different types and colors and styles and sparkles and glitter of spinnerbait color skirts. Primarily, my favorite choices when it comes to colors are going to be white and chartreuse. Any variation of those colors typically gets me through any watercolor situation. But just like with any other bait that we'll talk about in this series, it's going to be important to match the hatch and understand the forage that the fish are feeding on. And typically during the spinnerbait bite, they're feeding on some type of shad or minnow style forage. That's why it works so well. But nevertheless, the spinnerbait definitely mimics and has a good imitator of brim and panfish style forage as well. So typically when I'm throwing a Colorado bladed spinnerbait and I'm fishing in darker water, I'm not afraid to use those green pumpkins and oranges, and I'll still have some pearl in there as well. But don't be scared to deviate from that color either. Chartreuses, whites, pearls are typically the staples for me. And the darker the water, the darker that you want to go with your skirts. So if you got really dark water, don't be afraid to go out there and throw a black and purple, black and blue. Those colors actually really work well. They're not as popular, but if you want day in, day out, stick with your chartreuse and whites, and that'll get you through just about any other any watercolor situation that you'll come through. You know, I'm typically going to fish my spinnerbaits on bait casting equipment. You're going to be typically placing that bait in really tight areas. Spinnerbaits are great baits to bring across laydowns, around docks, underhangs, fishing it around structure. It's a great structure-oriented style fishing bait. So I'm going to typically throw it on bait casting equipment. Now, depending on what style spinnerbait and what you're actually trying to imitate determines how fast a gear ratio reel I use. Typically, I'm going to go with a lot slower reel when I'm using a spinnerbait. That lets that bait get down there. The faster you reel a spinnerbait, a lot of times has a tendency to kill the one side. But if you've got that perfect speed retrieve, that bait's going to track just perfectly and come right back to the boat. So I'm going to use a 5.5 to 1 most of the time. But if I'm going to want to reel that bait a lot faster, you can actually wake it right just under the surface. If I want to fish it a little faster, go to a 6.2 to 1, 6.3 to 1, 7.2 to 1 reel. And that's going to let you work that bait a lot more efficiently. But day in, day out, I'm going to use a little bit slower reel. I'm going to use about a 7-foot medium heavy action rod, something with a little tip in it that lets that bait, lets the fish get that bait in a little bit better. And you know, one thing you probably want to concentrate on if you're getting a lot of short strikes is don't be afraid to put a trailer hook. Trailer hook is really easy to install on these crankbaits. Basically, you've got one hook coming out of the jig head portion of the spinnerbait, and you can sell. Owner makes these, and you just slip that hook right over the hook point, and just attach a small piece of rubber. You can use a rubber band. This particularly just has a piece of polyurethane tubing on it. That keeps that hook from coming off your hook. So trailer hook is a good deal to use to keep you from getting short strikes. A lot of times the fish will just attack after the blade, and you'll get a couple short strikes. So trailer hooks are very important on spinnerbaits as well if you're not fishing around a lot of heavy structure. Now, as far as sizes goes, when you're talking about spinnerbaits, I'm typically going to use a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait. Those sizes typically get me through any situation that I need to get through. 3/8, I'm going to use that when I'm fishing around wood structure if it's not very windy and I don't need that bait to sink down very far. A 3/8 ounce double Colorado is what I like to fish around wood structure, laydowns, docks, floaters, around log jams, even around submerged grass. That's another good place to fish spinnerbaits. It's always good to fish them around submerged grass or fish it around the edges of emergent grass as always well as works really good as well. But if I'm going to try to get that bait down there a little deeper, get it down there, I'm going to use a willow leaf that lets that bait have a little less resistance, lets it sink a little bit farther down in the water column. I'm going to use a 1/2 ounce to get the bait down a little farther. Another reason you probably would want to go to a heavier bait, if you're working the bait really fast, the blades create some resistance and turbulence, and that's going to let that bait lift. If you use a little bit heavier style spinnerbait, you can work that bait really fast and wake it just below the surface without it bursting on top of the water, and you're going to waste a cast. So just depends on how you're going to fish the spinnerbait, and what you're fishing around is going to determine what size head you're going to use. But typically 3/8 and a 1/2 ounce gets me through just about every situation that I can find. You know, trailers are optional on spinnerbaits. A lot of guys like to put trailers on there, and trailers do work. Typically, I don't fish a trailer on my spinnerbaits, but you can fish a trailer to give you a little extra action and a little extra drawing power. If you want, you could just add like a little 3-inch swim bait, boot tail swim bait on the back side of your swim bait, and you can just install it just really easily. Most spinnerbaits come pretty well out of the pack just how you need to use them. You can buy just about any spinnerbait, pull it off the shelf, take it out of the pack, and start fishing and be just fine. There's a bunch of different blade combinations and skirt colors that you can choose, and most of them are ready to go right out the pack. And one way you can modify those spinnerbaits is just add a little trailer, and that just gives you a little more action. That also can give you a little extra resistance so the bait doesn't sink as fast. Adding that plastic on it gives the bait a little bit more bulk, so it's going to slow that sink rate down and keep that bait up in the water column a little bit better. So you can add a trailer that gives you a little bit more water displacement, adds a little bulk, and gives you a little bit more drawing power when you're out there fishing your spinnerbaits. So that's the first segment of the basics. Just fishing spinnerbaits. That's a great way to fish all times of the year. I've caught fish on spinnerbaits all 4 seasons of the year. It doesn't matter if it's clear, it doesn't matter if it's stained water. Spinnerbaits work pretty much all year long. So get out there, try your spinnerbaits. Experiment with the different blade types, Colorado, willow leaf spinnerbaits, and you don't have to worry quite as much about your colors as long as you stay in those pearls and chartreuses. I feel like you'll be just fine, but don't be afraid to experiment with the color choices and see what works best for you. Spinnerbaits, great way to catch fish. You definitely want to use them no matter where you fish.